Tack and Coffee, A Soldier's Life in the Civil War is a classic memoir written by John D. Billings, first published in 1887. This engaging account provides a vivid and often humorous look into the daily lives of Union soldiers during the American Civil War. If you enjoy this type of content, please like and subscribe. These are Billings' words. Let's begin. There was another source from which soldiers, at least, some of them, replenished their supplies or added variety to their meals. This method was known as foraging, generally understood as seeking out food, whether for people or animals, and taking whatever was found, particularly in enemy territory. Initially, the army was hesitant to adopt this practice to increase its resources. Early in the war, many prominent government and military officers believed that showing restraint and respecting the enemy's property would encourage the South to return to the Union. They feared that destroying property or seizing personal items would only harden the enemy's resolve, unite them further, and prolong the war. For months after the war began, Northern troops were forbidden from taking fence rails, poultry, pigs, straw, or any similar items for personal use. When commanding officers ordered the use of straw stacks or fences, certificates were issued to the owners, promising eventual reimbursement. However, as the rebellion grew and intensified, it became impractical to issue certificates to everyone whose property was seized. Moreover, it was discovered that many certificate recipients were secretly aiding the enemy. Consequently, the issuance of these receipts gradually declined. Another obstacle to widespread foraging was the presence of soldiers who had been taught to adhere strictly to the Ten Commandments. These men, influenced by their upbringing, viewed taking another's property without permission as no different from stealing. Such soldiers refused to forage or benefit from the spoils of others' foraging. When a commander with these beliefs led a regiment, foraging among his men was rare. However, as the war dragged on, it became evident that sparing rebel property only strengthened the enemy and weakened the Union cause. As a result, these moral objections largely faded, and by the end of the war, a soldier who still held such scruples was an oddity. At this point in history, we can consider the practice of foraging more calmly and weigh its moral implications. International law states that in a hostile region, an army is permitted to live off the land, thereby conserving its rations. For most soldiers, this justification was enough to take whatever provisions they desired from the enemy. If all laws were based on absolute justice, this rule would settle the matter. However, laws do not change personal conscience or individual convictions. Each person must ultimately follow their own moral compass, guided by their conscience. The average soldier's perspective aligned with the international law. They believed that the people of the South, by engaging in rebellion, had forfeited their property rights. They saw foraging as one of the risks the South assumed by raising the banner of secession. Soldiers justified taking provisions as a necessary part of warfare. While this view might seem plausible, it becomes less defensible when foraging extended beyond immediate needs or targeting items that could aid the enemy. The authority to forage often included the power to act as judge and jury, with no appeal. A farmer claiming Union loyalty might lose his corn or chickens if he couldn't prove his allegiance on the spot. Many who were truly loyal suffered losses because their sincerity couldn't be verified immediately. Much of the foraging, though officially prohibited, was often ignored or even condoned by commanding officers, who sometimes shared in the spoils. However, it was not always done judiciously. After the first few months of the war, many homes along the Army's route were left destitute of food, clothing, and animals. The Army of the Potomac, repeatedly traversing the same areas in Virginia, left little behind for local farmers. People in these areas often gave up on planting crops, knowing that any harvest would feed one army or the other. As a result, extreme poverty was widespread, and some families were truly desperate. No one with a conscience could take the last cow, pig, or ear of corn from a struggling family. Yet unauthorized foragers often did just that. While rebels might have forfeited their property rights, their innocent families should not have been made to suffer. Families known to assist the enemy often faced retribution, but even these instances highlight the moral complexities of foraging. Some families, left utterly destitute, were forced to appeal to the nearest army headquarters for food. Without horses or proper transportation, they sometimes walked for miles. Any horses they owned were often seized by Union or Confederate cavalry. Occasionally, families would salvage an abandoned and emaciated horse or mule, nursing it back to health as best they could. These animals, branded with US or CS marks, were then hitched to makeshift carts cobbled together from old carriages or farm equipment. These sorry-looking contraptions, drawn by barely functional animals, carried families over rough Virginia roads in desperate attempts to survive. When such an animal regained some vitality, unless it was carefully concealed, it would soon be pressed into service again by one of the armies, leaving behind another exhausted creature in its place. However, later in the war, any animals abandoned by the Union Army were shot if they were still alive, cutting off even this limited resource for the local inhabitants. Families had to rely on their remaining livestock, like the family cow, which was often repurposed for labor or survival. The soldiers, however, did not limit their foraging to food and fodder. Acts of wanton destruction, often senseless and inexcusable, were sometimes committed. For instance, during the Army's entry into Fredericksburg in 1862, soldiers reportedly delighted in bayoneting mirrors, smashing piano keys with musket butts, throwing crockery out of windows, and destroying other harmless household items. If they had been drinking commissary whiskey, their behavior often became even more unreasonable and destructive. When such disgraceful conduct was discovered, the perpetrators were arrested and court-martialed. However, these individuals represented only a small fraction of the army, though to their victims, they must have seemed far more numerous. Regularly authorized foraging parties, led by commissioned officers, did not indulge in such excesses. Their missions were clearly defined: to locate and collect provisions from smokehouses, barns, or corn cribs. If they encountered livestock like poultry or pigs, these were often taken as well, benefiting the Union Army at the expense of the local population. Typical items collected by these parties included hams, bacon, flour, sweet potatoes, cornmeal, and corn. In some cases, they also took dried corn leaves, called corn shucks, which were used as winter fodder for livestock. In the South, where little hay was cultivated, cattle often survived the winter by browsing. As the Army moved through new territory, it encountered large quantities of corn stored in ricks. For example, at Wilcox's Landing on the James River in June 1864, the Union forces crossed the river and discovered vast amounts of corn stored on a rebel-owned farm. The corn was loaded onto forage wagons and taken to feed the Union Army's many animals. Similarly, when troops entered areas south of the James River near Petersburg, they appropriated significant supplies of corn that had not been touched by Northern forces before. In this region and in the area stretching from the Wilderness to Cold Harbor, large quantities of tobacco were also found in various stages of curing. Drying houses were filled with tobacco, their walls made of spaced logs to allow airflow. Inside, tobacco stalks hung upside down on poles. Other buildings contained tightly packed hogsheads of cured tobacco. Petersburg, a center for the tobacco trade, had numerous factories, but the war had halted operations by cutting off northern markets and blockading southern ports. As a result, tobacco had accumulated in vast quantities. Soldiers who enjoyed smoking or chewing freely helped themselves, although many still preferred the processed black Navy plug sold by sutlers for $1.25. While camped at Warrenton Sulphur Springs after Gettysburg in 1863, soldiers from my company were detailed daily to collect grass for forage. Armed with scythes from the battery wagon and accompanied by a mule-drawn wagon, they ventured out to mow grass wherever it could be found. Other batteries followed the same practice to supplement government supplies. Sherman's bummers, known for their foraging expertise, were infamous for their thoroughness during his march to Savannah in 1864. According to Sherman's Special Field Orders No. 120, issued on November 9, 1864, foraging was to be conducted liberally, with each brigade organizing dedicated foraging parties under responsible officers. These parties collected provisions such as corn, meat, vegetables, and cornmeal, aiming to keep the troops supplied with 10 days' worth of provisions and 3 days' forage at all times. Soldiers were forbidden from entering homes or committing acts of trespass, though they could gather vegetables or livestock near their camps. Officers overseeing foraging were instructed to avoid abusive language and, when appropriate, to leave families with enough provisions for their survival. Sherman justified these actions by arguing that those who had provoked the conflict should bear its consequences. His foraging parties often ventured miles from the marching column, visiting farms and plantations to gather supplies. Their hauls included bacon, cornmeal, poultry, and even livestock, which they transported back in farm wagons or carriages. Sherman himself acknowledged that while most foraging was conducted responsibly, some soldiers committed acts of pillage, robbery, and violence. For example, items like jewelry were occasionally stolen, and not all plunder reached the commissary. Despite this, Sherman noted that his army reached the sea with more cattle than it had started with, and that Georgia alone lost approximately 15,000 mules to the campaign. No other campaign in the Civil War resembled Sherman's march in its scale of foraging and its impact on local populations. Other armies engaged in similar practices on a smaller scale, but Sherman's campaign stands out for its comprehensive approach. Among the various branches of the military, the cavalry had the greatest opportunities for foraging. As the eyes and ears of the army, they often led advances and scouted new territory, taking the best supplies before the main force arrived. When stationed on outpost duty, they scoured the countryside for provisions, seizing everything from poultry to beehives. Cavalry raids also relied heavily on foraging, as troops lived off the land during their missions. Infantry units, while more restricted, also benefited from foraging opportunities. Soldiers on picket duty or special assignments often visited nearby farmhouses to supplement their rations, sometimes by purchase and sometimes by force. Roadside homes in the direct path of the army suffered the most, as waves of soldiers passed through, leaving little behind. Families who lived along routes traveled by both armies were especially unfortunate, often left destitute after having their last provisions taken by one side or the other. Some residents, anticipating the army's arrival, managed to hide their most valuable possessions. However, those who hesitated or were caught in the act often lost their treasures. Cornfields near the roads were particularly vulnerable, as soldiers stripped every ear of corn for their own use. Even the stalks were taken to feed horses and mules. Volumes could be filled with stories of foraging, but I will share just a few incidents that I personally witnessed. The people of Maryland generally experienced less foraging than those in Virginia. This was because more Marylanders were believed to be loyal to the Union and thus received some protection. However, I personally believe the Virginians were just as loyal as the Marylanders. Nevertheless, many soldiers, especially those new to the service, assumed every white man south of the Mason-Dixon line was a secessionist. Often, they were right, but this assumption led to more foraging by fresh troops compared to their more experienced counterparts. Before my company experienced any hard service, we were stationed at Poolesville, located 38 miles from Washington. We were part of an independent brigade under General Heintzelman, included in the defenses of Washington. While stationed there, drilling and living on government rations, a sergeant of the guard risked losing his rank by leading a midnight foraging party. He first shared the general countersign with the group and then led them on their mission. The target that night was a flock of sheep, which had often been eyed hungrily by the men as they passed the pasture during routine trips to water their horses. The pasture was about half a mile from camp. Under the cover of darkness, the party approached the sheep. However, the sheep scattered, and the foragers gave chase up and down the small enclosure. One eager but reckless member of the group fired his revolver multiple times in the chaos, missing the sheep entirely but succeeding in alarming the outer pickets. This caused them to fire, which was reported back to camp. The long roll was sounded, and 2 regiments of infantry scrambled to prepare for what they thought was an enemy attack. Meanwhile, the foragers sneaked back to camp by the shortest route, managing to capture 2 sheep that had been run down. The truth behind the commotion remained a secret within the company until years later, when the story was revealed at a reunion in 1879 or 1880. On another occasion, a small group of men snuck out of camp at midnight in search of poultry. They had a specific farmhouse in mind but struggled to locate it in the dark. Upon reaching the property, they realized there were no separate outbuildings and decided the L attached to the main house must be the chicken roost. Though entering the L risked waking the farmer and his family, the group decided to proceed. They found the door padlocked but used a piece of iron to remove the staple and open it. Guards were stationed around the house with drawn revolvers, though none of them would have dared fire. Inside the L, one man lit a match and confirmed they had found the chickens. Among them were 2 turkeys, which, along with several chickens, were passed to a comrade at the door. The turkeys and chickens were quickly killed with a penknife and placed in a bag. The group brought their haul to the home of a local secessionist, where a servant named Black Mary cooked the turkeys for 25 cents in Union scrip. At least one officer from our company enjoyed the feast, blissfully unaware of its questionable origins. Beehives were another popular target for foragers. Soldiers would walk miles at night in search of these treasure troves of honey. I recall an incident in the 10th Vermont Regiment, where some foragers brought a beehive back to camp after their comrades had settled in for the night. As a prank, they placed the hive on the stomach of a sleeping captain, creating immediate chaos in that part of the camp. Foraging wasn't without its dangers. Many soldiers faced punishment for leaving camp or their column without permission. Others were killed during their expeditions. On December 7, 1864, while Warren's Fifth Corps was destroying sections of the Weldon Railroad, some men who had strayed to forage were found murdered along the roadside. Their bodies were stripped naked and horribly mutilated. In another instance, during Sherman's campaign in the Carolinas, a forager was found hanged from a tree with a sign reading, "Death to all foragers." During the same Fifth Corps expedition, a group of soldiers left the column, crossed a stream, and approached a house on a hill. A cavalryman among them spotted 2 turkeys. The birds, sensing danger, flew onto the roof of a smokehouse and then onto the ridgepole of the main house. Determined to catch them, the cavalryman climbed after them, crawling along the ridgepole. Suddenly, a bullet zipped past him. Believing his comrades had fired at the turkeys, he shouted angrily at them. When another bullet struck a shingle near his leg, he realized the shots were coming from Confederate sharpshooters. He immediately slid down from the roof and retreated, his pursuit of the turkeys abandoned. Foraging was not limited to food. A veteran of the 7th New Hampshire recounted how a soldier named Charlie Swain, known for his foraging skills, once tried to steal 2 pigs from a pen near St. Augustine, Florida, in 1863. Swain managed to coax the pigs into a barrel, tipped it upright, and carried it on his back toward camp. However, the pigs began squealing, the bottom of the barrel gave way, and the pigs escaped. Before Swain could recapture them, a cavalry patrol appeared, forcing him to flee empty-handed. It is not my intention to portray Union soldiers as uniquely harsh foragers. Southerners on Northern soil were often more vindictive, fueled by hatred for the Union, while Northerners hated only slavery. Atrocities were committed by a small minority in both armies. Foraging, as I have shown, had legal justification, but once the practice was permitted, it often led to uncontrollable excesses. These excesses disproportionately harmed defenseless women and children, who bore little responsibility for the war. Unfortunately, such collateral suffering has always been a part of warfare and likely will remain so until wars finally cease. What was an army corps? The term comes from the French phrase corps d'armée and retains much of its original meaning. Since the time of Napoleon I, armies of more than 50 or 60,000 men have typically been divided into smaller, more manageable units called army corps. Soon after the outbreak of the Civil War, Lieutenant General Winfield Scott, celebrated for his distinguished service in the Mexican War, found himself too old and infirm to lead an active campaign. Command of the troops rapidly assembling around Washington was therefore given to General Irvin McDowell. McDowell, a capable soldier, lacked experience in commanding large-scale operations, as did every other officer at the time. His first task should have been to organize the inexperienced troops into cohesive and effective units, but he was not given the time to do so. The loyal citizens of the North demanded swift action, insisting that the rebellion be quashed immediately. President Abraham Lincoln faced constant pressure to act without delay. McDowell requested more time to train and prepare his forces, but his pleas were denied. It was argued that if the Union troops were green and inexperienced, so too were the Confederate forces. Public impatience was so intense that McDowell was even criticized for reviewing a group of 8 regiments, which some saw as unnecessary showmanship. Consequently, with little more than a rudimentary organization of his troops into brigades, no proper artillery, no commissariat, and no trained staff to assist him, McDowell divided his force of approximately 35,000 men into 5 divisions. 4 of these divisions were sent across the Potomac River in Virginia to engage the enemy. The result was the Battle of Bull Run, a chaotic confrontation where brigade commanders lacked knowledge of their commands, and soldiers did not know their generals. It was, in effect, a battle of individual regiments rather than coordinated brigades. Although Bull Run was a battlefield defeat for the Union, it served as a sobering wake-up call for the North. Many who had believed the South would not fight were proven wrong, and their relentless pressure on President Lincoln subsided temporarily. This pause allowed for better preparation. Attention soon turned to General George B. McClellan. Young, capable, and experienced, McClellan had served in the Mexican War, studied European military practices during the Crimean War, and recently led a successful campaign in West Virginia. On July 27, 1861, McClellan assumed command of the forces around Washington, which then comprised approximately 50,000 infantry, 1,000 cavalry, and 650 artillerymen equipped with 30 field guns. McClellan inherited a disorganized and demoralized force. Many of the troops were remnants of McDowell's defeated Bull Run army, while others were new arrivals from the north. Discipline was virtually non-existent, with officers and soldiers absent without leave and the streets of Washington teeming with idle troops. McClellan's task was monumental, to transform this chaotic mass into a disciplined fighting force. The first step was to organize the infantry into brigades, each comprising 4 regiments. New regiments arriving under President Lincoln's recent call for 500,000 three-year volunteers were placed into temporary brigades and encamped near the city. There, they received equipment and training in military tactics, preparing them for the challenges ahead. Once sufficiently trained, these regiments were assigned to permanent brigades stationed across the Potomac. As the brigades gained cohesion and discipline, McClellan moved to the next phase, organizing divisions. By mid-October 1861, 11 divisions had been established, each consisting of 3 brigades of infantry, 1 to 4 light artillery batteries, and 1 or 2 cavalry units. The final step was to create Army Corps, but McClellan approached this cautiously. He believed it prudent to wait until his division commanders demonstrated their ability to handle larger bodies of troops. This approach reflected sound judgment, as even the Confederate authorities did not adopt the Corps system until after the Battle of Antietam in September 1862. However, the North's patience wore thin as 1862 began, and the refrain "all quiet along the Potomac" became a byword for frustration. Public pressure intensified, demanding action. President Lincoln, under relentless criticism, issued a war order on March 8, 1862, requiring McClellan to organize his forces into 5 Army Corps. Unfortunately, the order also specified the Corps commanders, depriving McClellan of the opportunity to appoint the officers he deemed best suited for the roles. Each corps consisted of 3 divisions, with each division comprising 3 brigades. A full-strength regiment contained 1,046 men, so a brigade typically included about 3,000 to 4,000 soldiers. While this structure provided a systematic organization, it was not always rigidly followed. Some corps had a 4th division, and divisions sometimes received additional brigades to bolster their numbers. Over time, as units suffered losses from sickness, capture, and battle, brigades and divisions were replenished with new regiments. This constant process of addition and depletion led to some brigades consisting of the remnants of 10 regiments while still having fewer men than a fully equipped brigade. At various points during the war, there were 25 Army Corps in service, excluding specialized units like the cavalry, engineers, and signal corps. As losses mounted, some corps were consolidated. For example, in the spring of 1864, the 1st and 3rd Corps were merged into the 2nd, 5th, and 6th Corps. Similarly, the 11th and 12th Corps were combined to form the 20th Corps. This overview of Army Corps provides the necessary background to understand the organization of the Union Army and lays the foundation for discussing Corps badges, an important aspect of military identification and pride during the war. What are Corps badges? The answer to this question is somewhat detailed, but I believe it is an interesting topic worth exploring. The idea of Corps badges likely originated with General Philip Kearny, although the precise circumstances and timing remain somewhat unclear and steeped in legend. Since I joined Kearny's Corps about a year after the introduction of the concept, I do not have first-hand knowledge of its origin. However, I have heard various accounts from men who served under him. These accounts differ in the details of how the Kearny patch came to be, but consistently credit Kearny with the idea, noting that it was initially applied only to officers. General E.D. Townsend, the former Adjutant General of the United States Army, provides a plausible explanation in his book Anecdotes of the Civil War. He recounts, "One day, when his brigade was on the march, General Philip Kearny, a strict disciplinarian, saw some officers standing under a tree by the roadside. Assuming they were stragglers from his command, he rebuked them harshly, using a few choice expletives. The officers stood silently, respectfully maintaining their composure. When Kearny finished, one of them raised his hand to his cap and calmly explained that they were not part of his command. Realizing his error, Kearny immediately apologized and said, 'Pardon me, I will take steps to ensure I can recognize my own men in the future.' When he returned to camp, he ordered all officers in his brigade to wear a conspicuous round piece of red cloth on the front of their caps for identification. This became known as the Kearny Patch. While General Townsend's account is widely accepted, it seems likely that the initial order applied only to officers, as corroborated by testimony from officers in the old Third Corps. Furthermore, an order issued after Kearny's death by General D.B. Birney on September 4, 1862, supports this interpretation. The order, issued while Kearny's division was stationed at Fort Lyon, Virginia, announced Kearny's death and included the following directive. As a token of respect for his memory, all officers of this division will wear crape on the left arm for 30 days, and the colors and drums of regiments and batteries will be placed in mourning for 60 days. To further honor his memory and distinguish his officers as he wished, each officer will continue to wear on his cap a piece of scarlet cloth or have the crown piece of the cap made of scarlet cloth. This order suggests two things. First, up to that point, the patch was required only for officers, as no mention of enlisted men is made. Second, it is unlikely that Kearny specified a specific shape for the badge, such as the lozenge, as some claim. If he had, General Birney, a meticulous man, would not have referred to it merely as a piece of scarlet cloth or offered the alternative of making the cap's crown piece scarlet. When red fabric was unavailable, Kearny reportedly sacrificed his own red blanket to create the first patches. These emblems quickly gained popularity among the rank and file, who began fashioning their own patches from the red lining of their overcoats or other available materials. There is strong evidence that the shape of the patches varied at this stage, with any piece of red fabric serving the purpose. The patches became a point of pride among Kearny's men, who idolized their daring and bold commander. They proudly wore the red patch to distinguish themselves as part of his division. The patch also had practical benefits, reportedly reducing straggling and ensuring wounded or dead soldiers received more considerate treatment from the enemy. There is reason to believe Kearny chose red for his division's patch because, on March 24, 1862, General McClellan issued an order specifying the colors of flags for corps, division, and brigade headquarters. According to this order, the 1st Division flag was red, the 2nd Division flag was blue, and the 3rd Division flag was a combination of red and blue. As Kearny commanded the 1st Division, red was a natural choice. The popularity of the badge soon spread beyond Kearny's division. Other divisions, envious of the distinction, began adopting their own identifying symbols. Recognizing the potential to harness this esprit de corps, Major General Joseph Hooker formalized the use of corps badges in the Army of the Potomac with an order issued on March 21, 1863. General Daniel Butterfield, Hooker's chief of staff, played a significant role in designing and implementing this system. The order read: Headquarters Army of the Potomac. Circular. March 21, 1863. To facilitate the recognition of corps and divisions within the Army and to prevent unjust reports of straggling and misconduct due to mistaken identity, the Chief Quartermaster will provide the following badges without delay. These badges are to be worn by officers and enlisted men on the center of their caps. Inspecting officers will ensure compliance during all inspections. 1st Corps, a sphere, red for the 1st Division, white for the 2nd, blue for the 3rd. 2nd Corps, a trefoil, red for the 1st Division, white for the 2nd, blue for the 3rd. 3rd Corps, a lozenge, red for the 1st Division, white for the 2nd, blue for the 3rd. 5th Corps, a Maltese cross, red for the 1st Division, white for the 2nd, blue for the 3rd. 6th Corps, a Greek cross, red for the 1st Division, white for the 2nd, blue for the 3rd, green for the Light Division. 11th Corps, a crescent, red for the 1st Division, white for the 2nd, blue for the 3rd. 12th Corps, a star, red for the 1st Division, white for the 2nd, blue for the 3rd. Sizes and colors will follow the provided patterns. By command of Major General Hooker S. Williams, Assistant Adjutant General. The badges became an essential part of the soldiers' uniforms, instilling pride and fostering unity within the ranks. Compliance was strictly enforced, with soldiers found without badges considered stragglers and returned to their units under guard. Over time, additional corps and divisions adopted their own badges, each reflecting their unique identity and history. This tradition of corps badges added both practical value and symbolic significance, reinforcing the structure and morale of the Union Army during the Civil War. The 13th Corps did not adopt a badge. The badge of the 14th Army Corps was an acorn. According to tradition, the soldiers of this corps referred to themselves as the Acorn Boys after a time of severe hardship, likely during the siege of Chattanooga by Bragg's forces. Food was so scarce that the men gathered and roasted acorns from a nearby oak grove to survive. This act of resilience and resourcefulness led to the acorn being chosen as their badge when it was officially adopted through General Orders No. 62, issued at Chattanooga on April 26, 1864. The badge of the 15th Army Corps originated from a humorous exchange between soldiers of different commands. During the fall of 1863, the 11th and 12th Corps were transferred from General Meade's army to the Western Theater under General Joe Hooker to help relieve Chattanooga, where General Thomas was under siege. The Eastern troops, better dressed and sporting Corps badges, then a novelty to the Western armies, sparked playful rivalry. One day, an Eastern soldier, displaying his badge, asked an Irishman from Logan's 15th Corps, "What corps do you belong to?" The Irishman replied, "The 15th, to be sure." The Eastern soldier then asked, "Where is your badge?" With a grin, the Irishman clapped his hand on his cartridge box and said, "There it is. 40 rounds. Can you show me a better one?" On February 14, 1865, Major General John A. Logan issued General Orders No. 10, officially adopting a badge inspired by this exchange. It was a miniature cartridge box stamped with 40 rounds, set on a field of cloth or metal. Logan encouraged his soldiers to wear the badge with pride, recalling their long and distinguished history under Generals Grant and Sherman. The 16th Army Corps badge was a circle with 4 mini balls arranged with their points toward the center. It was designed by Brevet Brigadier General John Huff, Assistant Adjutant General of the Corps, and selected from designs submitted by Major General A.J. Smith, the Corps commander. This badge, known as the A.J. Smith Cross, was distinct from the Maltese Cross due to its curved lines. The 17th Army Corps adopted an arrow as its badge, symbolizing swiftness, precision, and destructive power. Suggested by General M.F. Ford, the badge was officially adopted on March 25, 1865, through General Orders issued at Goldsboro, North Carolina, by Major General Francis P. Blair. The arrow for divisions was 2 inches long, while for Corps headquarters, it measured 1.5 inches. Wagons and ambulances were marked with larger arrows, 12 inches in length. The badge of the 18th Army Corps was a cross with equifoliate arms. A circular issued on June 7, 1864, and General Orders No. 108, dated August 25, 1864, detailed its design. Officers wore metal and enamel badges suspended by ribbons, while enlisted men used simpler cloth versions sewn to their uniforms. The complexity and cost of the original design led to simplifications in later orders. The 19th Army Corps adopted a fan-leaved cross with an octagonal center on November 17, 1864, through General Orders No. 11 issued by General Emory. The 1st Division used red, the 2nd blue, and the 3rd white. Enlisted men wore cloth versions of the badge, 2 inches square, on their hats or caps, though metallic badges were also permitted. The 21st Army Corps did not adopt a badge. The 22nd Army Corps, stationed in Washington, informally adopted a badge with 5 radiating arms and a circular center, although no official order was issued. The 23rd Army Corps used a plain shield as its badge, resembling that of the 9th Corps, with which it was temporarily associated. This badge was adopted informally, without general orders. The 24th Army Corps adopted the heart as its badge. General Orders No. 32, issued on March 18, 1865, described the heart as a symbol of devotion to the cause and respect for fallen comrades. Many soldiers in this corps were seasoned veterans who had re-enlisted, and they took great pride in this badge. The 25th Army Corps, composed entirely of African American soldiers, adopted a square as its badge on February 20, 1865. Major General Godfrey Weitzel described the badge as a symbol of equality and justice. He encouraged his soldiers to honor the badge through their courage and achievements during the campaign to end the rebellion. In late 1864, Major General W.S. Hancock resigned his command of the 2nd Corps to lead the newly formed 1st Veteran Corps. The badge, designed by Colonel C.H. Morgan, Hancock's chief of staff, featured a circular center with a red vertical band, surrounded by a laurel wreath and radiating rays that formed a heptagon. 7 hands holding spears pointed outward from the wreath. Sheridan's Cavalry Corps had a badge featuring crossed gold sabers on a blue field, surrounded by a silver halo. However, it was not widely worn. Wilson's Cavalry Corps adopted a badge with a carbine, from which a red swallowtail guidon bearing gilt crossed sabers was suspended by chains. The Engineer and Pontonier Corps used a badge featuring 2 crossed oars over an anchor, topped with a castle. While the official design included these elements, most engineers simply wore the castle, designed in brass. The Signal Corps badge consisted of two crossed flags on the staff of a flaming torch. Occasionally, a red star appeared on the flag of certain officers as a mark of distinction for meritorious service, but this was not part of the standard badge. The Department of West Virginia, under General Crook, adopted a spread eagle as its badge on January 3, 1865. Pioneers of the Army wore crossed hatchets in the color of their division as their badge. The Army of the Potomac took great pride in its badges, having been the first to adopt them. These emblems were painted on wagons and ambulances, making the Army's identity instantly recognizable. Veterans cherished their badges as symbols of their service, and many chose to have durable versions made from gold or silver, often inscribed with the names of battles they had fought in. To the men who wore them, these badges held value beyond measure. Though the material worth of such emblems might be modest, their meaning was priceless. No amount of wealth, not even the combined fortunes of an Astor or a Vanderbilt, could buy the experiences, sacrifices, and stories that these badges represented. For their owners, they were symbols of courage, endurance, and a legacy forged in the fire of war. That concludes the 8th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.